Hello and welcome to the next episode in our ongoing series of programs on leading in times of global crisis. We are broadcasting today from the beautiful campus of Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University. My name is Brandon Kirby and I am your host for today's show, and our topic of discussion focuses on interorganizational collaboration, especially during times of crisis. Have you ever wondered about the importance of collaboration or why some organizations join forces in times of crisis? What about the risks of collaboration? Over the next hour, we will discuss these and many more topics, so please be sure to stay with us. Joining me in the studio today is Birglan Arslan, which is the Assistant Professor of Innovation here at RSM, and her research focuses on success factors in interorganizational collaboration and how organizations collaborate in the context of imposing challenges. Welcome, Birgul. Thank you for joining us. As always, I'd like to remind our audience that you too can be part of the conversation by submitting your questions or comments in the chat room. You'll be sure to log in, ask your question, and leave us your name, and we'll do our best to address your question on the air. Birgul, perhaps it's a good place to start, since we're going to spend the next hour or so discussing collaboration, is to define collaboration. So from your point of view, how would you define collaboration?
All right, so we see inter-organizational collaboration happening when two or more organizations come together on a voluntary basis to pool their resources to achieve a certain objective. So there are three components: more than one organization coming together, second, pooling resources, and third, to achieve an objective that is otherwise very difficult to achieve alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also during our presentation today, we're going to be bringing in poll questions to the room. And so we're going to bring the first one up here in just a moment, which is going to ask, have you already seen collaboration in your organizations or companies since the current COVID crisis began? So take a few moments to answer those questions. And Birgul, while we're waiting for those responses to come in, maybe we can talk about why do companies collaborate?
So in the actually last decade, we see a lot of organizations joining these collaborative activities, and there are three basic reasons for that. The first is that they can share costs, the costs of big projects like oil pipelines, and they can also share risks of developing a new technology and risks associated with entering a new market. The third reason that they come together is that they can combine complementary resources. These are the resources that rest in two different firms or two different organizations, and each firm is specialized in it. And when these are combined, they have a synergistic effect. They are either more effective in combination, or using those resources, companies come up with faster solutions for the challenges, especially technological challenges that they are facing in their industries.
And I think that makes sense when you're thinking, especially from a technological standpoint. As you can see here on the screen, we have some of the responses to the poll, and it looks that a fair amount of people have already seen collaboration with others during this time of crisis. Is this something that surprises you, being that it's happened relatively quickly, or is this in line with what you're seeing in your research?
This is quite in line in what I would have expected happening in the face of the crisis that we are facing, because crises usually require a very fast response. And organizations don't have the time to acquire the necessary resources on their own. So we see companies or other organizations collaborating to address this issue.
Absolutely. So when these companies come together, obviously they're hoping that their ventures are successful. I mean, yes. I think that's the intention of doing such collaborations. So are there some success factors and perhaps some risk factors that companies should consider before doing an alliance or collaboration?
Yes, we can think of in terms of 3 C's. The first C is complementarity. I touched upon this before, but why is that a success factor? It is because if there is complementarity between two organizations, it means that those organizations will be more willing to continue their collaboration, because they know that they depend on each other for the successful achievement of their objectives. The second C is compatibility. If organizations are similar to each other in terms of the norms that they have or the organizational structure and processes, it will be easier for them to coordinate their actions, which are otherwise happening in different boundaries, if you will. And the third C is congruence. Congruence in terms of the, again, overlap between the priorities of the companies. If both organizations want the same thing, then we will see that collaboration happening in a much more positive way, and the likelihood of success will increase.
So do you see these happening in equal parts, or is one more prevalent than the other when you're thinking of the 3 C's?
All three, the complementarity, conflict, and congruence, all three are very important.
Excellent. Yeah. Now, what about the risk side of things? What are some risks? Because I think it's always important to talk about not just the positives, but also maybe some of the challenges.
Brandon, the very things that make these 3 factors important also make it more risky for organizations. So the fact that 2 companies are coming together makes coordination more difficult. It takes a little bit more than the coordination efforts that we are used to in our own organization. And the second is that there is also the likelihood of conflict. As things change, perceptions might change. You can never know whether your partner shares the same kind of motivation with you. So conflict, coordination, and finally, inter-partner competition can become a problem. Inter-partner competition meaning that one company is actually trying to learn from the other and trying to outpace it. So things like that might be quite problematic.
And when you're thinking about collaboration, we're obviously right now talking at the organizational level. Have you seen anything about collaboration with actual employees of these companies? Is it, you mentioned competitiveness. Is it, do companies find it challenging for different employees to work together from different companies?
Exactly. It might be the case that these people, the different employees, have different norms. For instance, in some companies, performance is very important. In others, kind of doing good is more important. In that case, there might be a culture clash between the employees of different partners.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, I know you have some examples of some organizations that have already combined or have combined complementary resources, which is one of the success factors that you mentioned, one of the 3 C's. And here we have on screen the first one, which is between Toyota and NTT. So maybe you can walk us through this example.
Yeah, Toyota is very passionate about building a smart city. And it has the capabilities for doing so. For instance, through its autonomous vehicle technology, the company has learned working with sensors and also working in artificial intelligence. So they thought, why don't we use it in a smart city? However, in a smart city, they also needed reliable and fast connectivity. So they brought in NTT, a telecommunications company, for its expertise in 5G technology, for instance, in telecommunications, to be able to make sure that everything in the smart city is connected. So this is a very good example of how complementary resources come in to actually achieve something that the humanity hasn't been able to achieve yet.
Absolutely. And you had another example, which was more focused with tech, if I remember correctly, or finance.
The finance, yes.
Yeah.
The funny thing about this is that when we talk about technology and innovation, finance industry doesn't necessarily come up as the first industry. It isn't really the first that we can think of. However, even that is changing nowadays with the rise of fintech companies. Here we have an example of ING working with a fintech company, TradeTech, in order to open up a new market. So historically, banks would keep their trade finance assets on their own balance sheets and couldn't really make a market out of it. But it was possible that other non-bank institutional investors would be interested in investing in these assets. But the main problem was that it would be very difficult for these outside actors to assess the actual risk of these assets. And TradeTech, a fintech company, came in. It was the first platform to bring in these two different actors, the bank and the non-bank investors, and through artificial intelligence, they could assess the risk profile of these assets, and they made it available for sale to other investors. So they created a new market opportunity, a complete new way in finance in that matter.
To be able to do that. Now, based on the research you've done and just your experience within this area, do certain industries lend themselves to collaboration easier than others, or is it pretty universal that it can work anywhere?
It can work anywhere, yes, but some industries are a little bit more prone to collaboration, and pharmaceutical industry is one of them. Because in this industry, in the last decade, we have seen a lot of new technologies coming up with gene editing possibilities. And now a lot of biotech companies are forming, which are specialized in R&D and discovery of drugs. Then we have the big pharma companies, which are very good in, so they have money, capital to invest, and they are also very good in pushing those drugs through clinical stages. So this is a perfect complementarity example. And in fact, because of these complementarities, we have seen that the pharmaceutical industry has been able to develop the first vaccine against Ebola. It has recently been approved by FDA in December 2019. And it's a fascinating example, it's a fascinating technology. They combine the genetic material of Ebola and another virus to make sure that we can develop an immune response to a virus that is not really dangerous for us.
Absolutely.
So pharmaceutical industry is engaged in a lot of collaboration, and they are very successful
for that. And I know a little bit later you have some great examples of Ebola and collaborations. Now, we've talked about the benefits and success stories, so to speak, with collaboration. I'd like to bring in our next poll for the audience in the room, and that is to look at the main obstacles for collaboration. What do you think are some of the main obstacles for collaboration? We're going to put that out. We'll bring the answers back in just a moment. But maybe we can talk a little bit about examples of risks, or when things maybe don't go the way that you plan. Of course, you go into it with the best of intentions, but due to various reasons, some of which you mentioned earlier during your risks, you have an example here on screen with Danone and exiting a venture in China. So maybe give us a little background on this particular example.
Yes, unfortunately, we also see sometimes when things go sour. And the example that we have is from a actually very big joint venture, a $2 billion joint venture in China, led by Danone when it wanted to enter the Chinese market. And Danone partnered with Vahaha, a local partner, and that partner brought the local knowledge, whereas Danone brought the product knowledge. Yes. And it has been very successful for a while until that success became a problem. So Danone saw that and accused the chairman of Vahaha of actually establishing a parallel, couple of even parallel companies to sell the very products of the joint venture. And this was being done through the close circle, the relatives of the chairman. On the other hand, Vahaha also kind of accused Danone of investing in competitor joint ventures or competitor companies to be able to bigger in that market. So they ended up going through excruciating 2 years of legal proceedings, a lot of name calling. And at the end, Danone had to sell its stake to Vahaha and exit the joint venture. So from whichever perspective you look at it, this has been a really unfortunate outcome of the relationship.
Of course, in litigation, the only person who wins is the lawyers, so to speak. Now, when you're thinking about collaboration, are there differences between collaborating with a private company versus a public company versus maybe a state organization? Are there any differences between collaborations or rules of engagement than what you've seen in your research?
Basically, company, so we call this private collaboration, is a little bit more business as usual for for-profit organizations because they speak the same language. However, public-private partnerships might be a bit more difficult because what is important for each might be different. So companies are generally driven by profit, but public sector is generally driven by altruistic objectives. In that case, making these objectives congruent takes a bit of an effort, especially in the beginning, making sure that each partner's different needs will be met through this collaboration. So it's a bit more complicated.
A little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
We had a session recently with one of our fellow professors who was talking about working with governments, especially when they come in to take over companies during times of crisis, like we see sometimes now with companies coming in to sort of prop up, private organizations to help them keep running. So it sounds that even in the collaboration sense, there's also some unique challenges there. Maybe here on the screen, you can react to what we're seeing here. The question was, what do you consider the key factor for companies to collaborate among themselves? You can see that crisis response, what I believe is 47%, is kind of the runner out there, followed by market opportunity. So when you see this, especially, it seems like people in the audience are really gravitating towards using a crisis response as a moment to collaborate. I'm guessing that probably lines up maybe with what you see in your research.
Exactly. I'm very happy to see this result, actually, because I have done some research on how organizations respond to crisis in terms of collaboration and how that plays out. And I did that on the Ebola crisis that we have gone through in 2014 in collaboration with a colleague of mine here at RSM, Murat Tarakçı. We have collected data on the collaborations that organizations came up with to deal with Ebola. And as you see in the next slide, during the crisis in 2014, the number of headlines, news headlines that are mentioning Ebola has sort of skyrocketed. So there has been a lot of push on the pharmaceutical sector to actually do something about this. And at that time, we didn't have anything to deal with this virus, nothing at all beyond supportive care. And this push has actually led to an increase, a parallel increase in the number of partnerships that organizations are forming. And in these slides, you can see that in 2014, we see again a rise in partnerships against Ebola. Then in the next step, we looked at how these partnerships performed. Have they been able to develop the drugs, maybe push them to the next stage in the clinical development? And we found yes. Actually, Because of the 2014 crisis, the companies have allocated more of their resources and their motivation, if you will, to come up with something for Ebola, such that the success rate of Ebola partnerships has increased dramatically compared to what happened before. So this is very good news. We see that organizations do respond by collaborating to the crises, and when they do so, they are also effective. But there is one caveat.
I was going to say at the same time,
yes.
there's another side to this story that I think you're about to share. We have a slide here on screen for that as well.
Exactly. At the same time, we decided to look at what is happening on a related field. Influenza. Why did we choose to look at influenza? Because influenza is a virus that is actually a big kind of a challenge for us. We are not aware of it, but it also kills perhaps way more than Ebola does. Every year we see thousands of people, tens of thousands of people dying from influenza. And what we have seen is that when Ebola drew all this attention and resources, we have seen that the partnerships that are formed for influenza, first, their frequency decreased. So companies were not really engaging in collaboration against influenza. And second, the ones that were established were not as effective. So it took them longer to actually push a drug to the next development stage. This basically tells us that while it's natural for us to kind of change our attention focus to issues that are more imminent, we should also really consider what is happening in related but also important fields. So there is a trade-off for which we really need to strike a good balance.
Yeah. And not to speculate, but have you given any thought as to why this sort of phenomenon happens? Is it just because it's in front of us? Is there maybe some capitalistic intentions behind it? There's a market opportunity, as some people had put in the poll. Why do we sort of see this shift? Is it human nature? What is behind this in your view?
This is a very difficult question. We thought about very long and hard, is this market opportunity motivation? But it turned out that the market for Ebola is actually much smaller than influenza. It's smaller not only because the virus is actually not as contagious, by the way, lucky for us that it's more difficult to spread. And so it doesn't really easily become a worldwide pandemic. On the other hand, the people who need it are typically poor. So you cannot really price a drug to a very high level. So, and the companies know that. Companies working on Ebola actually know that the market is not that big. Still, they worked on it. And I think that's the reason, the main reason behind it. It's at some point necessity drives organizational activity. Organizations, perhaps, I might be a bit optimistic here, but organizations might not be that much profit-driven.
So if there was ways to incentivize perhaps the research in that, which I know happens already now, but so that there is still, beyond the altruistic benefit of developing it, do you think if there were other incentives that were put in place perhaps that could increase collaboration and sort of combat some of the things you're mentioning here? Yes,
we are seeing it happening actually. We see increasing collaboration between private sector and public sector. And when this happens, the needs are also heard and addressed by profit organizations as well. So it is happening, and I believe that it will be a stronger force in the future that we can address these issues together. From very different perspectives and actors.
And that makes sense. We'll talk about the future later on because you definitely have some thoughts around that. I want to bring in our third poll now, which is going to ask the audience the key factors for companies to collaborate. We have some choices there for you, so we'll let you kind of ponder that for a moment. And Birgül, let's turn our attention now to kind of the current situation. You know, what kind of responses are we seeing? Are there unique challenges that we're facing, or is this a pattern that is repeating itself? We have an example here on screen of some collaborations between companies. We have several of those. So what are your thoughts on, what are we seeing now? Does this remind you of Ebola? Is this different?
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
So fortunately for COVID, we see a lot of collaboration between companies. And the first area of collaboration was very fast. Companies have decided to scale up production for ventilators. And we see also actors that we wouldn't otherwise think about to come in, join in their efforts in order to increase the capacity. For instance, we see here Dyson and Airbus doing that. We see Ford entering into this field. So companies, even coming from diverse backgrounds, different industries, have joined forces in order to come up with ventilators. As another example, we have leading companies in ventilator production coming together, including Philips, a Dutch company. So they have kind of decided to pool all the training materials, all the manuals for all of their models and make them available through a platform to healthcare workers. That was, in the past, they were all on different platforms. So it was very difficult for healthcare. It would at least take them time to figure out, to find the necessary resources to use this ventilator or that ventilator. So the companies stepped up and they were willing to share their resources to be put on a platform that is easily accessible for healthcare workers.
As well.
Yeah.
And we have a question here from the audience. We'll come back to some other examples here. The question is, how can companies be open enough to collaborate without compromising their own competitive advantage or perhaps even their own brand identity? So how can you go in and work together but still maintain who you are? I mean, how would you approach that?
Well, that's $1 million question. That is something that the collaboration research has tried to be dealing with. The biggest problem is in this, as you said, losing proprietary assets to the partner. And at some point, I think this is a little bit inevitable. But as long as the company that we are focusing on is fast in innovation, that wouldn't really matter because it would have its own pipeline of enhanced products and resources. Some things that may help in kind of protecting companies' proprietary knowledge and resources against spillovers to the partners is to make sure that the coordinated activities but it's very difficult to achieve that the coordinated activities remain within the boundaries of the firm while at the same time kind of coordinating them with the other party. But again, it's quite difficult to achieve.
And I think you spent a lot of time talking about the coming together of organizations. But how about when the time comes to sort of say, okay, we've accomplished, mission accomplished, we've solved what we set out to do. How do you see, or what's been your experience of watching companies sort of de-collaborate, I guess, I think of the best word for it.
What we see, if the alliance has been successful, it actually ends naturally because it's based on a contract with a specific objective, then everyone parts happily. But what we see is that in these cases, those partners, instead of just parting from each other, start thinking about what can they do next. Usually that's what we see. For instance, the example that I have gave on Toyota was a second partnership between Toyota and NTT. First, they wanted to work on autonomous cars and their connectivity alone, but they found out that it goes very well, and they took it to the next step. Usually that's what happens. Otherwise, of course, in bad situations, we either see a lawsuit.
Here it is again.
Yes, or some nasty announcements on the news, and then they part after that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems that it's all or nothing right now.
Yes.
As well. I'd like to maybe bring in the poll responses that we had, if I can see that up on screen here, perhaps. We'll give it just a moment. There we go. So again, what would you consider the main obstacle for a successful interorganizational collaboration? I think this goes well with the question that you just responded to. It's kind of an even mix amongst changing circumstances, cultural differences, infighting among partners. You've already addressed that. Maybe let's focus in on the cultural differences. We haven't really talked about that. We've really looked at the collaboration from really a company, high-level company or organizational standpoint. Mm-hmm. But what about cultural differences? I mean, what can companies do to, what have you seen for them to either ensure success, or what have been some of the challenges that you've seen them try to overcome?
Yeah, in terms of culture, we can think about it from two perspectives. Norms are an important part of organizational culture. So what is good? What is called good behavior, what is expected behavior from our employees is part of the culture. So these are basically the priorities that we set that kind of direct us in taking the decisions that we take. So if these norms are different among the two companies, then there is this is an important setback, but this can be dealt with during the negotiation process. To each collaboration, we see actually a long negotiation process going on between the two partners or more. And during that stage, it is critical that first they understand each other, the priorities, the norms, what is expected, what is accepted. And if they see mismatch, it makes sense to actually come up with a common understanding, come up with the common norms that will guide the partners' decision-making process moving forward. This is not as easy as I tell,
of course.
But there is a possibility to overcome that problem. Otherwise, it might make sense to actually not to start that collaboration. The other aspect of culture is the things that we do, the processes, the structures that we have. This is a little bit more difficult to handle because a choice has to be made which way to go. Typically, for instance, let's think about two organizations coming together, one with a very bureaucratic hierarchical culture, the other with a very flat culture. Is it possible to reconcile these two? I don't know. But at least if partners see it in the very beginning, they can try to address it in the way that they structure their partnering activities. However, there is no doubt that it will be difficult as well.
Okay. Now, we have another question we're going to take, so I think it's great to involve the audience here. So the next question here is, what do you think about collaboration between companies of very different scale? So for example, how does collaboration between banks on fraud management differ from collaboration between a bank and a fintech startup? So you gave that example earlier of the fintech startup. Do we see differences in how companies approach things if you have a very large, huge multinational with maybe a startup who has a technology that can be implemented and applied across a range of products? Is there a difference? And if so, what does that look like?
Excellent question, by the way. The first thing that we can think of in terms of differences in size is the bargaining power. The bargaining power is a little bit more equal if we think of two big banks coming together. However, if we see a bank collaborating with a small fintech company, inevitably one of the partners will have a bigger bargaining power, a higher. And in this case, we can think that the bank has more of a bargaining power than the fintech. Why? Because the fintech company probably relies and needs more, relies more on its partner than the other way around. So in these cases, that is a little bit problematic for the small firm. Because even during the negotiation stage, the small firm finds it hard to get a big return on its potential investments in the collaboration. One way that this can be, by the way, this is a kind of a very usual problem that we see in the pharmaceutical sector as well, between pharmaceuticals, big pharma, and the biotech companies. One way that this can be not necessarily fully eliminated, but one way that can be a smaller problem is if the small company has resources that are not found anywhere else, so unique resources, and if these resources are actually very synergistic with the resources of the big firm, then this company is in a better bargaining situation. In that case, we can have more fruitful and more mutually beneficial collaboration between the two.
So having that product, service, or technology can help give leverage to a smaller company, especially as it relates to partnering with a larger company.
Exactly.
Now, going back to some examples of successful collaborations, you briefly touched upon the Ventilator Training Alliance, which we have the screen up here on camera. And I think one question as I look at this is we've talked a lot about products. is there a difference? Does it tend to be that collaborations tend to focus on outcomes that involve products such as medicines or things of that nature, or can it also be services? What's the blend on that? Is one more prevalent than the other?
But product alliances can be thought of to be more prevalent because they are more visible and easy to touch on. However, with the rise of the service sector, we also see a lot of collaboration going on in services. And by the way, we shouldn't really think of these collaborations focusing on a concrete, sellable product or service. We can also think of collaborations for coming up with a technology that is later to be used for a product or a service. So it can be anything that you can basically think of. It can be a project, a product, a service, a technology. So we should think of collaborations from a wider perspective.
From a much wider perspective. Now, I think it's interesting, you were talking about what was happening during the Ebola crisis and media attention and the number of headlines and how that seemed to impact the number of alliances. Are you seeing something now that is, working more towards that? Are there similarities in this regard? We have a slide here on screen which is talking about sort of the same setup, which is the number of headlines surrounding COVID versus the number of headlines around Ebola. So maybe you can talk to me a little bit about, what are we seeing? Is it similar? Is it different? Is it the same thing?
Yeah.
What are we seeing now?
Actually, Brandon, we're seeing the history repeating itself. When I've took a brief look at what is happening on the news front, I see the same thing happening with Ebola crisis. So we see that, again, we have a tremendous increase in the number of headlines, news headlines mentioning COVID. And this also, again, in parallel to the Ebola crisis, has increased the number of collaboration in the pharmaceutical industry in parallel. So the good news is that probably this will lead a much more effective clinical development processes for the 99 vaccines that are currently under development and hundreds and actually 180 treatments that are currently considered. So this is good news on the side that we can think that the efforts towards this drug development will be faster and more effective if the collaborations wouldn't be there. And in fact, actually, before this crisis, we haven't seen many actors being engaged in this area, but now we see them. So we believe that they will be, so everything, it's all hands on deck, everybody is very motivated. So I think that we will see progress in this area. On the other hand, I don't know if you know, but currently there is a second Ebola crisis going on.
When you mentioned this to me earlier today, I was surprised.
So it's the second biggest.
Yeah.
It has affected more than 3,000 people and led to the death of more than 2,000. And because we are much more focused on the crisis of corona, and perhaps rightly so, we don't really have the span of attention for understanding what is going on in the Ebola front. And we are afraid that this might have a negative effect on those efforts or any other efforts. FDA calls it neglected diseases. So diseases are there, but are we putting enough effort, given that now all hands are on deck for COVID? Perhaps not. So it's really important for the pharmaceutical company or the broader community to be mindful about these potential negative effects that this surge might have on other fields.
So it seems that there is a correlation between the amount of coverage that a particular, whether it's a disease or humanitarian crisis. I'm looking here at the slide we have here on screen, which is talking about partnerships, and they reached a peak in March. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put you on the spot here. I see that we're gone from 130 approximately, and we've dropped down to 108. When we rush to collaborate, I'm guessing some partnerships and alliances are meant to stand the distance and go longer, and some of them might be, coming together quickly to accomplish a particular goal that's more short term. Do you see this as a trend that will continue to go down, in your opinion, or do you think that it will level off? What do you see based on your experience?
Well, at some point it has to go down, but it doesn't mean that the attention is not there. So the trend, we shouldn't really interpret it as putting less attention, but it's just that there's a saturation point. There are only so many organizations that are active in the viral infectious fields that can collaborate to address this issue. So it's quite natural and inevitable that we will see these numbers going down. However, the good news is that there has been, so in total, there has been a lot of effort to address this crisis.
Do you see situations where a company might, or an organization might collaborate with more than one party on different areas? And if so, I'm sure that adds to complexity, but is that something that you see in your experience?
We see it. Usually when companies collaborate, they do it in a single drug. There are very few companies that have more than one drug that is going through clinical trials. But it's possible that they collaborate even on a single drug with different parties. For instance, for a single drug, a company can go on and work with a public agency to tap into their financial resources to get grants, and then collaborate with a biotech company on the basic science, and then go on and collaborate with a company that is specialized on manufacturing in order to make sure that the drugs will be available for phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. So we can see multiple partnerships with different goals for the same drug.
I have another question here from the audience, which is saying that we're showing examples of cooperations in response to a crisis. How do these numbers of cooperations compare to, for example, to market synergy cooperation? So, when you're thinking about, these collaborations being formed during the crisis, are they more, or are they less for those that are just formed for market synergy?
I think when we mean market synergy, do we mean entering into new markets?
That could be, and maybe another way to think about it could also be, two companies realize that they can come together to go into a particular market. I have a technology, maybe with the Toyota example you gave earlier, there were some overlapping synergies in a similar market. So I guess the question would be, do we see more alliances, collaborations happening specifically around, like COVID, for example, around these sort of crises versus, let's say, normal operations of looking for, competitive, there's some overlap where we can go to market together and cooperate? I
think in the periods where when we don't necessarily see a crisis, we see more collaboration for entering into new markets, for making better products in a way that we can address or maybe grow a given market. But in the crisis mode, we see more of a crisis response in terms of partnerships. I don't know if that answers the question.
We can always pick up a follow-up question from that person as well. One other thing that you talked about, and you briefly touched on, and we have the slide here on the screen now, which is about, you spoke a little bit about neglected diseases. Maybe a few comments on, how COVID specifically has changed the approach within the scientific and research community. I know that's something that we spoke about before our conversation today, so I'd love to hear some thoughts on that from you as well.
Yeah, we see something strange going on. Strange, but in a very positive manner. The first impact that COVID had on the usual way that the scientists worked was that the scientists put all other priorities aside, all other personal ambitions aside, and they started sharing their findings and data even with the rest of the world, the scientists in the rest of the world, without really thinking about how this would impact their careers. Because in their field, in the field of these scientists, it's important to keep your data such that you can publish papers on it which will have a positive impact on your career prospects. But in this case, no one almost thought about it. They put the science first. And the good news is that we also see a similar trend among companies as well. We see that companies are putting the crisis first in terms of their priorities, instead of thinking this is my asset, this is your asset, how am I going to benefit from it? For instance, we have seen that we have seen collaboration even among Google and Apple, which we would think are arch rivals. They are arch rival enemies. And one of the, for instance, biggest field in which they competed was the maps technology. And so actually, Apple was very unhappy with the number of Android operating systems that are in use, and it wanted to have its own maps, and therefore blocked, in a way, the Google Maps on its iPhones. However, in this case, we see that they are collaborating to open up their platforms to an app that can track people with the disease. So I hope that this will continue. I am not sure whether we will keep this sentiment afterwards, but I think in general that people learn from crisis. And I'm hopeful that companies also will at least put a bit more of a bigger emphasis in kind of being a bit more altruistic and sharing in their collaboration, such that we can, as a humanity, address the grand challenges that we are facing today.
And I think that's the hope of a lot of people, is that
Yes.
we can take sort of this momentum that we've had of working together and collaboration, and that it will be a long-lasting impact. I'm sure there are some cynics in the room who probably think that things might go back to business as usual. And I think your point about research publishing and careers, not only of academics, but of course the broader sense of anyone, there will probably need to be a real tough look at maybe making changes or exceptions, or really looking at this frame of time to see how it can impact and affect jobs, promotions, and things of that nature. So I think it's an interesting point that you bring up. Now, you also talked about altruism and hoping that people would maintain that. Rotterdam School of Management's mission statement is to be a force for positive change in the world. Correct. So I think that's a great segue there. And it's based on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals put forth by the United Nations. And they cover everything from gender equality to access to education, access to clean water, building sustainable cities. So these are very large, lofty goals. And interestingly, SDG number 17 is partnership for these goals. So developing partnerships to overcome these, because I think that for most, if not all of them, it would be almost impossible for one particular company, country, organization to solve any one of these particular challenges, at least on a large scale. So maybe you can speak to us a little bit about how collaboration can be this powerful tool that we're really going to need to not only get through the current situation, but to also address these other challenges that we're facing through the SDGs.
Yes, so these challenges are quite difficult. We don't have a solution yet. And there is this increasing realization that no single organization has enough resources or capacity to address these challenges. So we are getting more and more aware of this fact. And we are also getting, of course, more aware that we will need more partnerships in order to address these challenges. Especially in the context of these challenges, we see that one of the outputs is the social good. So we are not really trying to achieve a market outcome, but we are trying to achieve a social good, a social outcome. And in that case, I think we expect that there will be more hands from public sector, from non-profit organizations, from government agencies, in order to kind of address these situations. And looking forward, we need partnerships, cross-sector partnerships between non-profits and companies in order to kind of address these challenges. And therefore, it's no surprise that the 17th goal, which is the last goal, actually is a goal that would provide the infrastructure for achieving the objectives for the first 16. So I think, I hope that this is already known, by the way, among the non-profit organizations and among the government agencies. I hope that the companies are also going to be more aware of this fact and hone their skills for collaborating with different actors with weird norms or weird kind of organizational structures and ways of doing things. And if we can achieve that, we can come up with meaningful solutions.
Solutions for that.
Yeah.
We have a final question here, which is how can interorganizational collaborations be stimulated in critical areas? So pharma, economical development of emerging markets. So for example, could that be through government incentives? And I think this ties in with what you were just sharing, which is bringing parties together on these large things. We've already talked about how there could be not always an altruistic reason for coming together. There could be a capitalistic reason, which is fine. This is business.
Yes.
But how can we incentivize businesses and states to come together to work together? What are some things you've seen work, or what would some of your thoughts be on this?
We see that we also already have a good kind of infrastructure for providing public funds for drug development or for addressing other challenges in that matter. And those public funds are very important. The very Ebola vaccine that I talked about has received multiple lines of public funds along the way until it's finally approved. We have that also within the European Union, and we have funds that are available for specific purposes for which companies can come together and develop proposals to get those funds. So that's one thing that we have. Another thing that may help collaboration is kind of providing a better legal infrastructure to avoid potential conflict. To avoid lengthy legal proceedings if there would be a conflict between the two. Better protection of intellectual property rights, for instance, could make companies more willing and less afraid for engaging in collaboration with others. So in terms of that legal infrastructure and funds, if we have those two, then we can be pretty sure that collaboration can happen. Another thing is that if the government agencies or non-profit organizations can come up, can learn how to collaborate and kind of create a common pool of knowledge about how this is best done, then we can see that companies can quickly keep up with that knowledge, and we can see more collaboration among different sectors, among different parties.
That's a great question and a fantastic answer. So we have just a few minutes left, and we spent kind of through this journey of collaboration over the past hour or so. We've talked about what's worked in the past, critical success factors, the risks. We've given examples of success and failures. We've talked a little bit about Ebola and how that's mirroring what we're seeing now with COVID. Maybe a good way to sort of send everyone off back into their day would be to talk about looking future, future looking. So what are some things that companies and organizations, people even should be thinking about? We have a slide here on the screen that sort of talks about scenario planning, but also preparedness. So maybe just give us some closing thoughts here before we wrap it up.
So in fact, every big company that is listed in any stock exchange is obligated to talk about the risks involved in its business. And traditionally, the risks that the companies mentioned involved the financial crises, because we undergo a lot of them, perhaps, and political unrests, because the big companies operate in multiple countries. But increasingly, we should realize that natural disasters and outbreaks are becoming bigger risks, perhaps, than the others. So we need to be aware that these risks are there and they are imminent. Actually, when I was doing my research on this, I was quite surprised that this pandemic was accurately forecasted by Robert Koch Institute in 2012. And in 2015, Bill Gates made this speech, a TED Talk, kind of trying to make us aware that we have to be prepared, because the next thing that will kill people, a lot of people, will be a pandemic, not weapons, not war. So the conclusion that I draw from here is that we know that things may happen, but what do we do about them? That's the critical part. So we need to be prepared. Given that we know that one of the good responses to crises is collaboration, we need to be kind of forming collaborations well ahead, such that we can develop our skills to quickly come up with the best partners, the best way of collaboration in terms of crisis. So that's one thing. We can keep that as a reserve capability that we're going to tap into once we're in the crisis mode. And the second thing is that I believe we will take another look at the way we think we manage our resources, because currently everything is efficiency, 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 zero inventory, just in time, zero cash and whatnot. So perhaps we might take a look at how we manage our resources and think about keeping some reserve capacity for ventilators, reserve ventilators just staying there, perhaps reserve medical personnel, right? So reserve. Maybe we can have some reserve, which we can also tap on during the normal times. They don't, especially human capital, it doesn't have to stand there. It can be used in many potential ways, but it has to be there in order to be able to address a crisis situation. So it's something to be thought about for the future.
Once we sort of get back on firm ground and everyone can sort of take stock of what's going on, I think there will be a lot of conversations happening at companies, again, within governments of how can we prevent, how can we prepare, and how can we be ready? Because as the world becomes smaller, it's not a matter of if sometimes, it's more of a matter of when, which I think is sort of what you just shared. Well, that is all we have time for today. Birgo, thank you so much. Our apologies if we weren't able to get to all of the questions. We do invite you to go to rsm.nl/learnwith to register for the other webinars that we have in our Leading in Times of Global Crisis series, which does include some of your colleagues from the RSM faculty. Also, to learn more about our online learning programs for individuals and companies, please also head to our website to check that out. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, please donate to the Erasmus Medical Center to help us fight this disease and to fund more research and more collaborations as well. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.